July 12, 2004, the book To Be the Man by Ric Flair has become the most talked about thing in wrestling over the past week, both for Flair's own self-portrayal, which even became an issue with his family, and his portrayal of several wrestlers, most notably Mick Foley and Bret Hart. To understand all of this requires an understanding of the background of the book and a lot of history and personal dynamics. As noted last week, the book was written by Keith Elliott Greenberg, a longtime writer for WW Publications, best known for his work in the Freddie Blassie autobiography that came out last year. It was edited by Mark Madden. Those right there are two entirely contrasting personalities. Greenberg is a member of the WWE family, as he's written for the promotion for 2 decades, and the book he wrote was very different than what was released. Different, as in less controversial. Madden, the former Nitro announcer, who has been friends with Flair for more than 15 years, is now something of a sports radio shock jock in Pittsburgh. He, and for that matter Flair, was looking for a harder and more opinionated book that would get people talking. Ironically, the final say-sos were Flair, since it's his book, and Vince McMahon, who has final control over everything. As the final result showed, McMahon sided more toward the Madden viewpoint, looking for sales, and there was very much talk of trying to parlay this book as quickly as possible into a second book. After all, Flair's career is such that a 332-page book really only skims the surface. The fact that in the acknowledgments at the end of the book, Flair thanks Madden, but doesn't say a word about Greenberg, speaks volumes. According to those very close to the writing of the book, Greenberg tried to either greatly tone down, or eliminate completely, the negative portrayals of Foley and Hart, in particular. It was the portrayals of those two more than any others, which have led to criticism of the book, because the comments on both made it out, and have led to many knocking the book without reading it because of the feeling he was unfair to both. He was hard on plenty of people, from DDP to Shane Douglas to Scott Steiner to Eric Bischoff, Hogan, Bruno Sammartino, and Jim Herd, as well as himself, but his portrayals of them haven't drawn any controversy. I haven't heard from anyone who has read the book that has given it a negative review overall, and it's in top level of wrestling books, partly because Flair has more real stories than all but a few in history because he was in so many different situations in a long career on top, as well as going everywhere as touring NWA champion. The book describes some of the fake title switches, those that happened that aren't recognized in record books, most notably his loss to Jack Veneno when he told Veneno to pin him, fearing for his and Roddy Piper's life, at a stadium show in Santo Domingo. In the cases of Martin Foley, they were written receipts for what Flair saw both had written about him in the past, Foley in his book, where he knocked Flair as a hooker, and Hart in his Calgary Sun newspaper column in the 90s. Flair even said so when it came to Foley, using the term receipt. The fact McMahon and his magazines pushed the Foley stuff to get people to buy the book has apparently driven a wedge between Foley and the WWE, although Foley has said nothing publicly at this point about the book. It's almost impossible to do a fair version of what this is all about, because so much of it is stuff that few know. For McMahon, I have no doubt the idea of him okaying the comments and, in fact, making sure the comments about Foley got out in Raw magazine was both to hype sales, but also because he was looking to use them in a Flair vs. Foley feud later this year. Flair has agreed to do the feud, including a climactic hardcore match. Foley is said to have turned it down, specifically due to the comments Flair made. Some in the company still believe they'll work Royal Rumble and/or WrestleMania, while others are most skeptical. There are issues of McMahon allowing Flair latitude in the book that he apparently wouldn't allow Foley in his writings. Word has it that Foley felt he had contributed far too much to the company to be buried to the level of comparisons with Ultimate Warrior and Brutus Beefcake, and he'd certainly be right on those comparisons. The line in question Flair was responding to was from Have a Nice Day, saying, Ric Flair was every bit as bad on the booking side of things as he was great on the wrestling side of it. It's unclear whether Foley's planned September return to promote a children's book that WWE is publishing is taking place. Make no mistake about it. Flair was not making the comments to promote a feud, but was certainly willing to use them in the feud. Exactly where McMahon's head is always subject to conjecture, but getting wrestlers to have real emotion against each other while he plays puppet master wouldn't exactly be a first for a promoter. There was a lot that has happened with Foley and WWE since his original retirement in 2000. Foley has been very careful how he's been booked and has been totally hands-on with his storylines, which he mainly wrote himself. In the end, he perceived himself as doing the right things for business, producing good programs and constantly putting over the guys the company was trying to make into top guys. He established High as a real world champion by putting him over time and time again in early 2000, including in 2 memorable matches, a street fight as Cactus Jack at the Royal Rumble in Madison Square Garden, and a Hell in a Cell match a month later where he lost with his career at stake. Most likely Triple H sees his rise very differently from a lot of fans. When he came back, he did the same thing, putting over Randy Orton in the same manner, constantly in the angles, and in a tag match at WrestleMania, and climactically in the final match, which elevated Orton's star greatly. However, during the interim, he was asked to come back for matches on other occasions, without strong storylines, and he turned the company down. This led to his leaving the company at one point, the famous somewhat shoot scene on Vince's airplane. However, on his return over the past year, it was said that Foley was constantly working with writer Brian Gewirtz on his storyline. Even if it was a huge success, and my own opinion was it was the biggest drawing match at Mania, that doesn't mean it went without criticism. Flair, on a promotional tour of England after Mania, knocked Foley as a wrestler, claiming he was just a glorified stuntman and criticized him for kissing up to the writers and worrying so much about his program backstage, and what people think of him. You have to understand the politics here of Flair being in the group with power right now since he's with Triple H and Shawn Michaels, both of whom had great matches in their career with Foley. Foley wrote Flair a letter and complained to John Laurinaitis about Flair's comments, feeling that since he was about to elevate Orton at Backlash in the weeks after these comments that Flair was hurting the match and hurting Orton's elevation by burying the guy who was going to lose to Orton to elevate Orton to a higher level. The letter did nothing to soothe feelings on either side. Foley was, on a few occasions, asked to wrestle on television, and refused. Feeling his few remaining matches should be special, he did end up doing one 8-man on TV in Chicago, which was most notable for being probably Flair's best single-in-ring television performance since his comeback after heart problems and the first Flair vs. Foley confrontation. Foley felt his program, and adding Flair to the match gave Flair a chance to appear on what was one of the biggest wrestling shows in history. Flair was originally not booked in the match, and worked it with a broken neck. Flair being told he was put on WrestleMania due to Foley wasn't going to go down well with someone with a legacy among more than anyone else as the greatest ever. Flair said when he first started on the booking committee, Foley was doing an angle living in homeless shelters. Flair had been on the booking committee when Foley was in the company prior to that, and credited Vince McMahon as a modern-day P.T. Barnum, turning him into Mankind and making him a champion. Foley has a cult following because of his contributions to hardcore wrestling. But hardcore is such a small part of the history of this business. When I was training, falling off a ladder was not a prerequisite to making it as a professional wrestler. Being fundamentally sound was. Occasionally seeing the inside of a gym was. When I trained under Vern Gagne, we started with 500 tree squats, 250 push-ups, 250 sit-ups, and a 2-mile run over farm terrain in sub-zero weather. And we came back to the barn to be wrestled into submission, cross-faced into submission, stretched into submission, and if Vern didn't like the way things were done, we'd start all over. He would have looked at Mick Foley on day one after Mick failed to do even one thing Vern required and said, "Mick, I don't think so." He went to say Steamboat, Gagne, Austin, etc. never fell off of ladders, and while Jericho, Angle, and Michaels did, they were respected as athletes first. But in my estimation, Mick Foley was not a great worker. He couldn't punch. He couldn't kick. In the World Wrestling Federation, he'd spend half the day before television broadcasts singing up to the writers because he's such a fan of himself. There's a difference between being a great performer and being a guy like Brutus Beefcake or the Ultimate Warrior who became famous because he happened to be working for Vince. It's the same with Foley. When he hasn't been working for Vince, there's been no demand for him whatsoever. He's just another guy. Realistically, what Foley would or wouldn't have done in Gagne's wrestling camp in 1972 is totally irrelevant, because he made it as one of the biggest stars of his time. There have been a few NBA stars who were cut from their high school varsity basketball team, and that hardly reflects negatively on what they did accomplish in the NBA. For all we know, Gagne may have seen something in Foley, and he may not have. But if he didn't, it would have been Gagne who missed seeing someone's unique drive. Dominic DeNucci saw something, and the idea of a guy going to college at Cortland State University in upstate New York and commuting to Pittsburgh every weekend, sleeping in his car, to learn wrestling is drive and sacrifice the likes of which can match almost anyone. Very few guys Gagne ever trained had careers that compared with Foley's. It is true that Foley's stunt work, and the famous Hell in a Cell match with Undertaker, changed wrestling, and in some ways, not for the positive. The style he inspired, which was only part of the style he actually did and he would be the first to speak negatively about, is virtually dead now anyway. What helped get him over to the level he eventually reached was timing, verbal ability, and connection with the audience. His ability to take sick punishment was only part of what made him. Could he work like Steamboat? No. But very few could, and he didn't try. You'll find plenty of old-timers make similar knocks on Foley, because he did things that weren't done in the past. Plenty of current wrestlers who worked with him will say he was a great worker. Foley found his niche, and I think it was more his ability to get himself over while also getting his opponent over. It was very different in execution, but the same trait Flair was the best at. McMahon turned him down for years because he didn't like his body and his look, looked down on his style, and didn't recognize his appeal. It was only through a major sales job by Jim Ross and Jim Comet that he even got in the door. He got in the door to be a freaky character. Mankind the Mutilator, as opposed to the Cactus Jack character he had become well known in both the US and Japan as. The plan when he came in was he would be the latest freaky guy who would work with Undertaker, and probably be moved down the card thereafter. The idea Vince took this guy who had never been a success and figured out the secret to making him a star is almost a joke. McMahon saw more in Mark Marrow, whom he paid far more, as well as people like Test and Nathan Jones, who he groomed from the start for stardom. Foley made himself a star by getting over through losing to Undertaker, and he did a great job of getting over Kane when Glenn Jacobs was hardly the level of worker that his push entailed. He took Triple H from being a questionable world champion who was handed a spot many felt he wasn't ready for, to being an unquestionable money-drawing headliner. He was a small promotion star in Japan as the king of the death matches and a headliner in ECW. He could have been more of a star in WCW if the booking wasn't so atrocious at the time, although you could say that about half the company. He headlined with Sting and Vader, and in the ring, he more than held up his end of those matches. He was hardly Brutus Beefcake. His non-WWF career compares favorably to Undertaker, is on the same level as Austin, and the bottom line is, Angle and Rock had no non-WWF career, and that's hardly a good reason to dismiss their talents, or credit their success solely to McMahon's marketing ability. There was an error when Flair talked about legal battles in 1991 over the famous belt, a replica of which is the current World Heavyweight title belt on Raw. Flair brought the belt to WWF, since he never lost it in the ring, and was never paid his deposit for it. Flair talked about the lawsuit saying WCW lost the suit, but actually WCW won the suit. You can imagine how well McMahon took losing to WCW in court. The first thing he did was commissioned a belt to be made to look exactly like the belt Flair had to return to WCW. WCW went back to court, claiming trademark infringement, and beat McMahon again. McMahon this time did the gimmick where he had to digitize the belt. The storyline was Jack Tunney refused to allow Flair's world title belt because it wasn't recognized by WWF to appear on television. While fans were given the impression Flair was still wearing the famous big gold belt, he actually wore an old WWF tag title belt. This was done until Flair won the WWF title at the Royal Rumble. He said he learned he was winning the title when he got to the building in Albany for the Rumble, but word was out well before that, and one don't want to say it was common knowledge, but in wrestling, everyone knew weeks before the show that Flair was getting the held-up title. That could be as much a memory lapse, although Madden himself was at the show, and didn't attend the show without knowing why he went. Flair said the original storyline was him losing the title to Hogan at Mania that year, but it switched to Randy Savage because Hogan and Vince's relationship deteriorated. I know that I knew, weeks before the Rumble, the top matches at Mania were Hogan vs. Sid and Flair vs. Savage for the belt, although before McMahon and Hogan had their problems stemming from the steroid publicity, it would have made sense the way McMahon and Hogan thought, for Flair to get the title by not beating Hogan, and to have the program end at Mania with Hogan pinning Flair. Sid had also been groomed for the Mania main event spot with Hogan. He was promised it months before Flair signed. While in hindsight people label it as a dumb decision by McMahon, and even Hogan has publicly said it was a mistake because the idea of putting a Hogan vs. Sid match above a Hogan vs. Flair match, at the time, it wasn't the case. It sure wasn't once McMahon decided due to all the bad publicity, that Hogan should take a hiatus to make him a sympathetic figure for a few months. Mania always had a fresh matchup, and Flair-Hogan had been done to death at the house shows, to the point the edge was off the match, and it would take a hardcore stipulation for it to pop on pay-per-view. Hogan vs. Sid was a new match that had never been done before. Plus, Sid was the perfect McMahon star for the time to face Hogan, although McMahon hadn't counted on steroid testing changing the playing field. Sid failed the test a week before Mania, although McMahon's contention that he didn't get the result back until after the match is believable, but that doesn't explain Sid then going on a European tour and coming back weeks later for house show main events against Ultimate Warrior before he quit the promotion. Then, after he quit, he was suspended for failure of a test weeks earlier. Hogan had assured Flair when they started working in late 1991 that they were saving their big match for Mania, and who knows if he meant it or not.
I know that when I heard it the night of the second ever Hogan-Flair match, I didn't believe it.
Flair said he didn't consider Savage a great worker, even though he respected his ability and what Held accomplished, because Savage planned out so much of his action in advance, and didn't leave much to improvise. He also said Savage was never as big a star after Elizabeth left him. Flair said McMahon's idea at Mania was to keep the title on him, but Savage complained so much, he changed his mind. In hindsight, it was a bad decision. There was steam in Savage chasing Flair, particularly because they worked a strong angle around Elizabeth and the promos building the first match were excellent on both sides. Once Savage won the first match, a strong match where Flair revealed it was Savage's idea for the blood that nearly got Flair fired because McMahon was so adamantly opposed to Juke, earlier in the same show. Hart bladed in his match with Roddy Piper, but Hart was able to convince McMahon it was hardware juice and he got away with it. But with Savage pinning Flair at Mania, the babyface goal had been accomplished. Business was probably going down the tubes anyway with all the problems in 1992, but heel Flair chasing Savage, who had already accomplished his purpose in the feud over the title, had no box office dynamic. Not to mention that the original feud was over Elizabeth, who walked out on Savage shortly after Mania, and had to be forgotten about and never mentioned again. Unlike other books, Flair wasn't kind to those who felt deserved reprisals, but more than just about any wrestler writing a book, he also wasn't always kind to himself. Wrestlers who read the book and idolized Flair told him the book shot holes in Superman's cape, such as his admissions of how deep his emotional problems were, not to mention his drinking as something more than wild partying, steroid use, and other decisions he seemed to regret, pointing the finger at himself for his first marriage not working. Flair's response was, well, that's the real story. And unlike most wrestlers, who like to portray themselves as the world's greatest shooters, Flair portrayed himself as a champion who some promoters were afraid to put on top for fear he couldn't defend himself in a tough situation. He admitted some of his own matches were terrible, and these were matches that ran rings around the kind of matches DDP tried to proclaim as classics in his own book. Like with Chris Benoit, Flair ended up as almost his own worst critic, or at least his worst critic among people who have a clue of what working wrestling matches is. He even pointed out early in his reign as world champion, when Harley Race, who had incredible respect among the wrestlers as the real deal from his numerous street fights in the 60s, was almost like his bodyguard in a match with Jumbo Tsuruta. The actual story is that Giant Baba, who had purchased 3 one-week world title reigns, 1 with Jack Briscoe and 2 with Harley Race, for fees of $25,000 and perhaps up to $40,000 for the final one, was attempting to purchase a short reign for Tsuruta to establish him as a higher-level Japanese legend. In 1981, NTV was wanting Giant Baba to step down, as the new generation of fans now saw the harder and far more popular wrestling promoted by New Japan, considered All Japan something of a joke, and Baba, who was a cultural legend, but a totally unathletic performer by this time, being on top is emblematic of it. It was actually the network, who still owned significant stock. Baba later, through company profits, purchased all the stock and voluntarily made himself a comedy mid-carder when he recognized he couldn't work up to main event standards that wanted Tsuruta moved ahead of Baba to the top. Baba, as a promoter, felt Tsuruta was lacking as far as the credibility to be the nightly main event draw. He felt having the status as being an NWA world champion would give him some of the necessary boost, and was willing to pay $40,000 for a short reign. Flair would have easily accepted it. The NWA board vetoed the suggestion for reasons I'm not clear on. NWA President Bob Geigel, because of turning down the offer, feared there may be a double cross, because nobody in the NWA ever fully trusted anyone else anyway, nor should they have, when Flair was scheduled for his first set of title defenses in Japan. As it turned out, there was probably nothing to worry about, and nothing ever happened in the match. But Race was in Flair's corner during a title match with Tsuruta because there was paranoia of a double-cross finish has now been confirmed by several sources. I believe the match in question in 1981, although listed in the book as 1983, may have also been with Lord James Blears as referee. If that's the case, that would have been insisted upon by Geigel, because by that point they may not have trusted an all-Japan referee in the ring either. With Hart, the dynamic is different as well. From 1993-97, Hart was often not kind to Flair in his newspaper columns. The two worked together almost nightly in late 1992 and early 1993. Hart's first WWF title win, on October 12, 1992, in Saskatoon, was over Flair. The company was collapsing at the time. The steroid controversy that enveloped the company led to McMahon doing legitimate testing. This led to wrestlers trying to find ways around the test, most notably using GH. While McMahon and his head of testing, Dr. Mauro Di Pasquale, a legitimate steroid expert, proclaimed they had a test that could also catch GH. To this day, there is no such test, but that didn't stop both from saying they had invented it and were putting it into effect that year. However, many wrestlers realized that was a bluff.
Nevertheless, many got caught, and within a few months, the guys McMahon was planning on building around, from Hogan, Ultimate Warrior Davey Boy Smith, Warlord, Sid Justice and Road Warrior Hawk all had quit, were fired, or on sabbatical.
Others, like Savage, started wrestling while wearing a shirt because they couldn't maintain their physiques and their performance started declining. More importantly, the combination of the bodies getting more natural and the unnatural headliners disappearing led to a sharp business decline. Flair was champ, going against the Warrior, who even he couldn't solve the puzzle of how to get a good match out of. The matches were bad and it wasn't drawing. Then Flair got hurt and they had no choice but to make a drastic decision. Hart was brought into a meeting with McMahon and Pat Patterson and told the company was going to have a change in direction. Hart gulped, thinking the next words were he was being let go. Instead, the next words were, he was getting the title. Hart himself would admit to having used steroids dating back to around late 1984, when Lai arrived in the company after working for years in Calgary and Japan, and saw how he looked compared with everyone else. But wrestlers like Hart, Michaels, Kevin Nash, and Yokozuna, either because of their natural size or natural ability, could, in McMahon's eyes, be used as headliners without steroids and maintain what got them to that level.
For that matter, so could Flair, but McMahon decided to move him down from main events, simply because in the McMahon formula, heels only had so much time on top and Flair had 16 months straight. Hart and Michaels didn't need steroids to be great wrestlers.
Guys whose bodies were such a large part of their appeal could not function as well with a real drug crackdown. It's as questionable whether Hart or Michaels would have gotten the same chances without drug testing limiting who McMahon could choose from to be the champion.
There is also the chance that had Hart or Michaels been put on top in the period business was already strong, both would have held their own as draws.
Flair was suffering from vertigo after October 9, 1992, in Phoenix, when he was dropped wrong by Warrior on a suplex, and was supposed to take at least a month off. He ended up working the next night in Los Angeles, because they had booked him and Hart. They drew 7,300 fans, which sounds average today, but at the time, an $112,000 house was considered very strong, and shocking since Hart had never had a run where he was even challenging for the world title. It was that gale that finalized the decision Hart was the guy. Flair dropped the title in Saskatoon, actually worked one last date at the Nassau Coliseum that following weekend, and took a month off. When he returned, he and Hart worked just about every night, before he gave notice, after negotiating with Bill Watts, and returned to WCW. Flair and Hart had good matches against each other at house shows, but there was underlying bitterness. My feeling is both wanted to call and lay out the match. Hart was a ring general, used to being in control. But Flair was the veteran, and the heel. There was also a personal dynamic. Hart truly believed he was the best in the business by that point, and Flair privately thought the same thing about himself. To Hart, Flair was not the best, a label he gave to Dynamite Kid. He was critical of Flair for doing predictable matches, which was a fair comment, being that's the one knock you can make on Flair. The counter of which is no man in history worked as many long matches by the time the style called for fast-paced action, and anyone doing that many long matches was bound to start looking repetitious. Years later, Hart, who didn't work the length of house show matches as Flair, but worked many long pay-per-view matches, started getting the same tag. Once Hart even wrote, on a scale of 1 to 10, that Flair was a 3. When the wrestling war was in full scale, Hart, generally the biggest WWF star, would often write negatively about Hulk Hogan, who backed out of putting him over in 1993, and Flair. He figured they were with the opposition and their paths would never cross, particularly in 1996, when Hart signed his 20-year contract with McMahon, and seemed untouchable. Wrestling is a strange business, as in early 1998, Hart was in WCW. Hogan was in control, and Flair was his first major opponent. It was funny, because in both the summer of 1996 and in late 1997, when Eric Bischoff was negotiating to get Hart in, the top guys in WCW were aware of the negotiations and pushed for Bischoff to get him, and people like Kevin Nash even called Hart to recruit him to come over. When he did come over, none of them wanted to work with Hart. At first it was well known Hart had to go over everyone. Strong Ori would make no sense because of both who Hart was, and because of the salary he was paid to jump. Flair was the easy choice, because he was still Flair, even if he wasn't pushed like Flair. Flair, unlike the other guys, had no problem putting Hart over clean, no matter what Hart had said about him. The original plan was to build a Hart vs. Hogan Starrcade 1998 feud, with Hart being put over by everyone for a year to build for it, but early in the game Hogan decided that wasn't happening. In Dayton, the site of a rushed pay-per-view match that drew a dangerously high buy rate that should have been good, but in WCW, it was bad, Bischoff came up to Flair and just said "sharpshooter" in 20 minutes, which at the time was considered terribly disrespectful, treating Flair like he was just a job guy to put over a star. Not that Bischoff hadn't been disrespectful to Flair at many other points. The buy rate was far better than anyone anticipated after just a few weeks of build-up, because the face-to-face interviews were classics, the fire of which came from Flair, but Hart more than held up his end. When the buy rate number came in at around a 1.0, far higher than anyone expected, when the number came out the feud was dropped. The company line at the time is that they didn't like that the crowd reaction was split 50-50, but anyone with half a brain going in that understood the wrestling crowd knew that would happen. Flair and Hale were pushed into being a babyface tag team. This solved the problem of people not 100% cheering Hart, but created another problem. After numerous angles that got big pops and strong quarter-hour ratings, the pairing was garnering much steam. Before they even did one match as a team, the idea of them teaming was dropped. Hart's altitude changed toward both Flair and Hogan. In the case of Hogan, it had to, as Hogan was able to point the finger at McMahon for the problems the EWO had in 1993. Hart was very receptive to that viewpoint, both because of his feelings toward McMahon, and his own knowledge of how McMahon manipulated him and Michaels when they were rivals for the top spot. Hart, as he got older, started seeing things from a different perspective, and his admiration for Flair's work grew, because of his conditioning and ability to take so many bumps when he was past 40 and keep going every night. Privately, he admitted his comments on Flair in his WWE days were more frustration for so many people saying Flair was the greatest ever. He even told me once that he reconciled that his negative comments on Flair were not about Flair himself, but about constantly reading from me that Flair was the greatest ever, and realized that wasn't Flair's fault. He believed he'd been in the ring with people like Dynamite, who were belter, conceding Flair as one of the best, but not the best wrestlers ever. Finally, a few months back, after Flair had so many strong performances on television in the early part of this year, when asked about Flair on our radio show by a caller, Hart said that he believed Flair wasn't human for being able to perform at the level he performed at a few months back after so many years of doing hard matches. He said he was a real Iron Man, and called him the best conditioned man he had ever been in the ring with. Of course, the book was written before this, and it's doubtful Flair knew any of this. He did remember 1993-97, and this book was going to be his time to respond to all the Shane Douglas and Scott Steiners who knocked him for no business reasons. Personally, one never saw dollar signs on Bret Hart. He was a good, sound, physical wrestler, but with limited charisma and interview skills. He also could have been president of his own fan club. Bret truly thought that he was the best technical wrestler who ever lived, and he was stuck in a routine that he refused to break, that being a receipt for Hart's similar comments on Flair's style of doing a lull of the same spots every night. He went on, "Don't get me wrong, Bret could have a tremendous match when it really counted. But, day to day, I found him to be inflexible. And in 1997, when Bret punched out Vince McMahon over a finish in Montreal, I was appalled." Rather than rehash that story, you have to realize a few things. Triple H, Flair's running mate, does not like Bret Hart. It goes without saying what Michaels' feelings are, and they are the two most influential wrestlers on Flair today. Flair also has never had anything to say negative about Vince McMahon as a person, since McMahon didn't change his gimmick in 1991 like he changed just about everyone else, including some huge stars like Dusty Rhodes, Harley Race, Barry Windham, Dory Funk, and countless others. McMahon gave him the WWF title, even though Flair was almost the embodiment of the opposition promotion in many fans' eyes. McMahon also, in the middle of a wrestling war, allowed Flair, because of a verbal promise, to return to WCW in 1993. Granted, McMahon may have thought Flair was done as a draw, as that was a mistake McMahon made with Hogan, Piper, and Savage, which bit him bad years later when it became clear all still had money drawing power left. In 1997, on two occasions, Hart was supposed to lose to Triple H, once early in the year in the tournament to create the first European champion, and once in Tulsa. In Europe, Hart got it switched and instead lost to Brother Owen, which allowed Owen and Davey Boy Smith to have a classic match in Germany on Raw for the European title when the plans were for Davey versus Triple H. They wanted Triple H to get a big win using China's interference. In Tulsa,
Hart did lose on Raw, which at the time made no booking sense since Hart was the champion and there were no plans for Triple H to be getting a title shot.
McMahon clearly had soured on Hart, and/or the size of Hart's salary, and probably wanted to get as many wrestlers' wins over Hart, which meant something, before he left. However, Hart changed the finish to a count-out with Michaels interfering, instead of a pinfall. Hart also got Triple H mad at least one other time. Triple H and Rock had always been at odds over who was to be the next chosen star, and I guess may have been played against each other. Triple H was handpicked, whether he likes to admit it or not, because he was tall and had a good head of hair, not that he wasn't a good wrestler, but he was given chance after chance when he wasn't getting over as the blue-blood rich guy who curtsied, and LUN's others, who were getting better crowd reactions, wouldn't get. Rock, maybe even more so, was handpicked because he was tall, good-looking, and had the family history. After Dwayne Johnson's first 2 pro wrestling dark matches at TV taping in Texas against Chris Candido and Steve Lombardi, I remember being told when I asked, "Who is this Johnson guy?" and was told it was the football player from University of Miami who was Rocky's son. I was well aware of Dwayne Johnson because there were many newspaper articles about him in college because of who his father and grandfather were, and that, this guy has it like you wouldn't believe. By the year 2000, he will be the biggest star in the company. That put 2 people at odds. Hart was booked to beat Rocky Maivia with a sharpshooter in a Raw match and refused, and I think it ended as a no contest. This is one of the reasons Rock always praises Hart, when he actually praises very few, because he recognized the people pushing the hardest for it were Triple H and Michaels, and understood their motives because of the jealousy over Rock maybe getting what Triple H felt he was groomed for. They apparently threw a fit at the time because Hart refused to beat Maivia clean. After all, when this took place, Hart was a main event heel, and Maivia was a failing babyface. However, Hart also saw something in Rock, as he wrote about that time, knocking Hogan for not passing the torch, that he would be glad when the day comes and he passes the torch gracefully to Rocky Maivia. The name shocked a lot of people at the time, who by that time, were souring on him because his smiley face act wasn't working. Of course, Triple H got his revenge as when Shawn Michaels called him a few nights before Montreal, after Vince had asked Shawn to lose clean to Hart in the famous match, in exchange for Hart dropping the title to him a month later in Springfield. On pay-per-view, it was Triple H who told Shawn, in no uncertain terms, he shouldn't be losing to a guy who is going to the rival company. When Michaels refused to lose to Hart, this set in motion what happened. Make no mistake about it, this is Flair's book, and not Triple H's or Michaels', but his views of that situation are going to certainly be affected by how those two view that situation, and that would hardly be favorable to Hart. To Flair, Hart refused to lose in his home country and then punched his boss over double-crossing him. Flair noted he never had a problem losing in Charlotte. Fans in the Carolinas know firsthand that to be true, and maybe wish they had, because most consider the constant burial of Flair and the Horsemen in the Carolinas as to why that part of the country was killed from a business standpoint by WCW. Of course, even if they hadn't, WCW was doing a good enough job killing its business that the same end result would have happened, just a little slower. I don't think Flair ever thought he himself was in somewhat the same position 6 years earlier, and that he refused to lose on his way out of WCW without a contract extension, and because of his not getting along with Jim Herd. Flair may be the one wrestler who walked in similar shoes to a degree. In the end, while not going public with it, then again, the attempt to humiliate him publicly also wasn't as strong. His reactions of not doing the job and, after it building up for years, punching his boss, were the same. The facts are this: Hogan, for all he did, right and wrong, drew a lot of money. Savage, for all he did, right and wrong, drew a lot of money. Roddy Piper, Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair drew big money. Bret Hart did not. Vince had other distractions at the time, but when Bret beat me for the title, the company went 10 hell for a while. There are various ways of looking at the period from 1993-97 in WWF. Hart was probably the single biggest star of that period, although there were periods when they tried and failed with Lex Luger, Yokozuna, Nash, and Michaels, and constantly went back to Hart, again, a position very similar to Flair in WCW. It was the worst period financially in company history. Some have argued Hart and Michaels were the glue keeping a sinking ship from collapsing. Others can argue they were two guys who couldn't draw on top. The company started going to hell right after WrestleMania of 1992, when Savage vs. Flair on one tour didn't draw for reasons we knew before it happened, and Undertaker vs. Papa Shango on another didn't as well due to the ridiculous voodoo angles they were doing. In looking back, the period with Flair as a heel champion, working singles and tags with Hogan and Piper,
averaged 6,500 paid. Flair's matches would have been actually 7,300 average as they ran split crews at the time, but many of those shows had Hogan, who a bigger draw than the title belt at the time. When Savage won the title, the figure fell to 3,770, with Hogan out of the picture. It fell to 3,300 when Flair regained it and worked with Warrior. Hart as champion, until he lost to Yokozuna, averaged 3,430. Nash as champion in 1995 averaged 2,930. Hart's run after beating Nash and losing to Michaels averaged 5,190, making him the best drawing champion since Flair, and that kind of an increase, even though Hart was champion during the traditional good part of the year, January through March, is pretty significant. With Michaels on top, and Hart not in the promotion, he worked some overseas stuff and a few pay-per-view shows, but didn't do house shows. The rest of 1996 averaged 4,560. When Hart returned to house shows in early 1997, and he was clearly the biggest star in the company at that point, although not the champion, that number increased to 5,720, but it was also the good part of the year till WrestleMania, where Austin became the company's biggest draw after their I Quit match and Austin's face turn. There was a major business turnaround in October 1997, before Hart and when he was champion, although it was probably more due to the popularity of Austin. When Hart left and Austin's popularity exploded, the company averaged 10,006 paid in 1998 and 12,017 the next year. At his drawing power peak, Hart was better than anyone in the company during the down period, but not on the level of the names Flair mentioned. But in 1992, much like post-Mania this year, so many top guys leaving at the same time spelled trouble. Plus, guys were legitimately shrinking and it was a company built on two things: Hulk Hogan and freaky bodies, and now it had neither. Hart certainly didn't turn things around, although he didn't say so in the book. Flair has conceded in the past that Hart was a huge deal in Europe because of his look, and it should be noted that Flair's thoughts on Hart as a champion or as a guy to build the company around go back long before he became pals with Triple H. By any standpoint, anything, either positive or negative as a draw that can be said about Hart, can also be said about Michaels. But while Flair didn't knock Michaels, and praised him in the ring, pretty much saying without directly saying that Michaels was the guy who he saw as his replacement as the best worker in the business, he also did not list Michaels as a big money draw. The biggest knock on Hart came for his comments after the death of Owen. Through his column in the Calgary Sun, Bret relentlessly bashed Vince McMahon. I sympathize with the emotion and even the anger he felt over losing a brother, but one lost respect for him when he made the case into a public spectacle. Why didn't he take the matter privately with Vince? It seemed to be that Bret cared more about getting screwed in Montreal than he did about Owen's death, and he used his brother's tragedy to grind his axe with Vince. That's also the statement, probably above more than anything in his book, that has garnered the most controversy. It's one thing to voice his opinion, and it has been his consistent opinion for years, that Michaels was a better wrestler than Hart. My impression from talking with a lot of modern-day wrestlers is that Flair would probably be viewed as the greatest ever, but Michaels might be in second place if you ask who the best worker there has ever been would be. Among current wrestlers, who grew up in the era when Hart and Michaels dueled for the top position, many would rank Hart right with him, and many ahead of Michaels, but all three would be in the top echelon. Flair had his own ups and downs as a draw, based on how good or bad his company or the time period was, but he was the biggest star in history in his part of the country, and his longevity as a superstar is unquestioned. The idea Hart cared more about the finish of a wrestling match than his brother's death is a bit much. But that is also the McMahon family viewpoint of rationalizing over the lawsuit, and it was a viewpoint McMahon got because several of Hart's siblings, who turned against Martha in hopes of approval or jobs from McMahon, were more than willing to give it to McMahon. Vince himself went on off the record in Canada and tried to use Hart's bitterness over Montreal as his defense when the subject of the death of Owen and subsequent lawsuit came up. Hart also hasn't said anything publicly, and due to his ongoing lawsuit with Lloyd's of London regarding non-payment of a disability policy after his career ended after a series of concussions which started from when Bill Goldberg kicked him in the head in late 1999, he may not be able to talk right now. He was in Europe this past week and hadn't read the book, but those close to him felt he was not going to like it. More because of who said it, as opposed to what was said, because Hart so greatly respected Flair. Jim Herd was an idiot. This is no defamation. I'm just telling you history. The man had no right to be anywhere near a wrestling company. When noting Herd was at one point station manager at KPLR-TV in St. Louis, he said, "A station manager is about as qualified to run a wrestling company as 1 a.m. to work for the Pentagon." Kevin Sullivan noted in the book it was Herd's idea to cut Flair's hair,
and he wanted to give him a Roman gimmick and rename him Spartacus. That's a true story, by the way, which tells you all you need to know about Hurt understanding pro wrestling. Flair refused the name change and the earring, but did allow the haircut. In the case of Diamond Dallas Page, who Flair personally didn't have any bad feelings for but felt was ridiculously overpushed by Bischoff, of those who were skewered, a lot are going to be driven crazy, even if some will publicly try and dismiss it, just as Flair did when Foley knocked him in his first book. All top wrestlers hate criticism, but they often can dismiss it because it's by people they don't respect, or can rationalize didn't have their experience and were never the level of stars they were. In truth, and Flair's book basically says this, there are probably only a half dozen or so people in the world whose criticisms he takes seriously, because very few people in the world have ever walked in his shoes, or, he feels, understands where he's come from. Flair's book revealed a part of his life, particularly his wild days of the 70s, that his kids and neighbors would have never known about. Moreover, even if they hadn't read the hook, the Charlotte Observer review of the book, which was positive, naturally brought up subjects like the steroids and kamikazes. In researching the book and talking about the 70s and early 80s footage with Ricky Steamboat, Blackjack Mulligan, Greg Valentine, Roddy Piper, Wahoo McDaniel and many others, and WWE being unable to locate the tapes, they found out some bad news from David Crockett. Crockett noted that in the late 80s, when Dusty Rhodes had booked the company into near bankruptcy, that they were so broke that they started taping over their old master tapes to save money, not realizing what the value of those tapes would be in the future. While there are bootleg tapes of most of Flair's angles from maybe 1978 or 1979 on, described in the book around, they are now 25-plus-year-old tapes, several generations old, and probably not upkept in the right climate, so the quality would likely be unusable. Actually, the first major star Flair took on was Bruno Sammartino. Sammartino was another wrestler who, in prior interviews, used to be upset that many referred to Flair as the greatest ever. He would say Flair was a great athlete, but again point to the predictability of his matches, claiming his own matches were all different. Bruno definitely generated intensity, and the fans in the Northeast went crazy for him. I have to admit, though, that I was far from overwhelmed. He was a tremendous draw, a great spokesman for the guys, but not a good in-ring performer. Sammartino could put an opponent in a bear hug or lift him over his back, but he was limited, especially compared to versatile NWA champions like Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr., and Jack Briscoe. The wrestling magazines all came out of New York, so Bruno was always number one in the rankings. But after seeing him wrestle, I thought, how could anyone vote him ahead of Harley? Christ, how could this guy be champion of anything? Flair said he thought Pedro Morales, WWF champ from 1971-73 when Sammartino, tired of the schedule, basically told Vince McMahon Sr. to get a new champion, was better. One saw Morales for years and was never impressed. Sammartino was nothing past an incredible aura, but Sammartino, because of who he was and his time, had that aura more than anyone. He said when Sammartino came to St. Louis, nobody cared because he was so far below the standards of the wrestlers they knew as champions. Actually, a 1973 Race vs. Sammartino match in St. Louis drew a near sellout Tequila Auditorium as something of a dream match for that generation. He also drew well in main events when he first arrived, off his national rep, with Ivan Koloff and the Invader Dick Murdoch. In the ring, Sammartino was not the caliber of worker as his reputation, and the feeling in hindsight among most were exactly how Flair described it. As far as comparing him as a worker to Race, well, Sammartino was successful in bringing crowds back month after month, for years, but also couldn't come close to doing the things in the ring someone like Race could do. From the standpoint of what Flair would have been taught was the level of a great wrestler, Sammartino would not have fit the bill. Flair said the term great in wrestling is thrown around too liberally, and didn't see Sammartino at that level. He said when he started, which would be the end of 1972, great wrestlers wore Race, Jack Briscoe, Dory, and Terry Funk, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Red Bastian, and Nick Bockwinkel. If you notice, that list consisted of the longtime NWA champs of the 70s and the 4 best workers in the AWA when he broke in. It's also notable that his 2 wrestling heroes at the time, Dusty Rhodes, who, when Flair broke in, he wanted to play the role of Rhodes' younger brother, and Billy Graham, super charismatic guys who weren't good workers inside the ring, he didn't rate as great, nor did he put another of his idols and the man he owes so much of his early success to, McDaniel, on the list, showing he doesn't throw out those accolades very easily and just because someone is his friend. He said he believed Verne Gagne and Luthez were great,
and for later in his career, added Ricky Steamboat, Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Steve Austin, Arnold Anderson, Shawn Michaels, Kurt Angle, Kurt Hennig, Kerry Gordy, and Barry Windham. He had reservations about the latter three, saying he meant when they were in their prime. He said Hennig didn't always mentally show up there, that Gordy developed a drug problem and Windham didn't physically take care of himself as he got older. He said Angle, he stayed healthy. This was written before Angle's second and third neck injuries, but after his first, would be one of the best ever. He also threw Undertaker's name in there for his personal admiration of his being a household name. Bret Hart's name came up, but only to say Michaels was much better and there was really no comparison. Flair talked about the politics in 1981 that got him the NWA title. Flair's name had been discussed for the title as early as 1975 or 1976. Jack Briscoe, in his book, said Flair had been discussed as a future champion when he was still champion, and that would be late 1975. When Terry Funk was champion in 1976 and early 1977, his name was stronger and Jim Crockett Jr. started pushing him. However, Crockett Jr. didn't have the political power, and Harley Race, who the NWA felt had done a great job in a transition run in 1973 between Dory Funk and Jack Briscoe, got the nod. By 1981, there were other candidates, including Fritz Von Erich wanting David. He was a huge draw in St. Louis already, which helped him, even though he was only 22 at the time. Tommy Rich, who along with Dusty Rhodes would have been the biggest national name because of him being the big babyface on Georgia Championship Wrestling, Rhodes, by far the biggest name and most charismatic performer on a national basis, but because he wasn't skilled in the ring and was out of shape, many of the old line promoters were very negative about him being champion. Ted DiBiase, who was the closest to the babyface Jack Briscoe prototype, and was the type Sam Mushnick would have picked, but Mushnick had lost power, and outside of St. Louis, DiBiase had never established himself as a top draw. Along with Flair, Crockett managed to get allies in Jim Barnett, who ran Georgia, where Flair regularly headlined, and Vince McMahon Sr., who never booked the champion but had a vote on the board at the time and was closest to Barnett to get Flair the title. The first title win, on September 17, 1981, in Kansas City, one would think would have been a memorable night in Flair's career. Getting the NWA belt established him as not just a regional superstar, but arguably the biggest name in the business. But it was bittersweet, as Rhodes didn't want to lose it, and the local promoter Geigel, who was NWA president at the time, was among those negative toward Flair as champion. Eventually, the promoters mostly loved Flair. He proved to be a great draw, and unlike the prior champions, Flair never complained when Barnett would ask him to work on his weeks off, or work double shots. 6 star 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 stars December 31, 2007. Only a few men in history are basically synonymous with the term pro wrestling in their part of the country, and on December 29, one of them has his final match in what would be considered his most memorable arena, and, perhaps, his territory. Ric Flair and Mid-Atlantic Wrestling go back to the spring of 1974, when Wahoo McDaniel recruited an AWA preliminary wrestler and brought him to Charlotte to work for Jim Crockett Jr. Ricky Flair, as he was known in his first few weeks in the territory, hailed from Minneapolis, as a cousin of Gene and Ole Anderson, the area's longtime Roughneck Top Hill tag team, rose through the ranks quickly. He was put in a tag team with aging veteran Rip Hawk to teach him the ropes on how to behave in and out of the ring, how to talk to draw money, and just what life was like in a territory Hawk had lived and worked seemingly forever. He was told by Hooker George Scott to watch tapes and learn to emulate Buddy Rogers, arguably the greatest heel in pro wrestling history up to that point in time, and the man many considered the best in-ring performer of the era. But while moves like the figure 4 leg lock and the strut that are now known as his trademarks and newer fans and wrestlers may even think were his inventions were taken from Rogers, his in-ring mentality and all-action style was taken from watching Ray Stevens, considered by many the greatest in-ring worker of the 60s. There is irony there, because Shawn Michaels, who became one of the best wrestlers of the modern era, grew up with the mentality of copying Flair in many ways. By the end of the summer he was working with McDaniel as part of double main events at the Greensboro Coliseum, the main arena in the territory. Soon he was working top matches with Dusty Rhodes, the top babyface in the NWA of that era. By the latter stages of 1975, with him being one of the keys to the reinvigoration of the territory, and with Jack Briscoe winning out as NWA World Champion, Flair's name came up as a serious choice. It was amazing, because the title belt was usually reserved for those who had become national stars for years, who had worked on top in most of the key territories,
and had proven to be able to draw. By that point, Flair had really only been a star in one place, and for not all that long a period of time. Even more interesting is that to the best of our records, Flair had never even faced Briscoe in a world title match. Most likely, when push came to shove, Flair was not going to be the pick for those reasons, but a broken back suffered in a small plane crash on October 4, 1975, near Wilmington, North Carolina, took him out of the running. 2 months later, Briscoe dropped the title to Terry Funk. When it was Funk's time to drop the title in early 1977, Flair had risen to the number 2 spot as far as the next champion went, an amazing accomplishment for someone who was still, despite all his wrestling magazine publicity, was only a proven headliner in one territory. Again, for that reason, Harley Race, a more proven worldwide commodity, got the choice. Flair, as a heel with Funk as a strong-held champion in the territory, never got a title shot in Greensboro. Flair's first world title match at the Coliseum was on May 15, 1977, in a match where both men were heels against Race, was a double countout before 7,000 fans, as in those days it was difficult to draw big crowds without the face versus heel formula, but that was still considered a solid crowd for a non-holiday show. It wasn't until September 17, 1981, when the 32-year-old Nature Boy won the first of his record 18 to 20 world titles, depending on what you consider a world title, as well as a title change, beating Rhodes in Kansas City. By that point, Flair had gotten over in the key NWA markets like St. Louis, Tokyo, and Toronto was an immediate hit in Florida. Through his appearances on the Superstation in Atlanta for the previous few years, as well as significant wrestling magazine coverage, which was a major deal in getting stars over outside of their local territory, plus his immediate charisma and promo ability, even in the places he had never worked before, he was a major superstar. Whether the 1980s Flair was the greatest of the world champions depends on your definition of the term. He was a big draw and a spectacular performer in his first run, which lasted until June 10, 1983, when he lost to Race in St. Louis. During that period, as well as in his second reign when his visits back to the home territory meant he was only appearing every couple of months in the cities, a Flair title defense in general doubled the average attendance, which would hover around 4,000 in cities like Richmond and Charlotte, and a little more in Greensboro, and usually 8,000 for his title defenses, and would draw even more for a particularly hot program. In St. Louis, Flair drew nearly 180,000 in 16 live appearances during his first 21-month title run, or 11,000 per show, an amazing number considering 12 of those 16 dates were in Kiel Auditorium, which only held 11,000. Shows Flair wasn't on average 7,000 paid. After an excellent build-up, almost directly starting after the loss, with memorable bounties, a retirement speech, a baseball bat comeback, Flair and Race had what is considered to this day the single most famous wrestling match ever held in that arena. A show called A Flair for the Gold saw Flair vow to retire, yes, 24 years ago, if he didn't beat Race to win the title in a cage match at the Greensboro Coliseum, with Gene Kiniski brought in as the special referee. At the time, few knew the significance of what was going down in the industry. Vince McMahon was planning on taking the WWF national, although virtually nobody was aware of it at the time. In fact, Vince appeared to be the best friend of everyone at the time, as his one-hour national television show, All American Wrestling, while concentrating on the WWF, would air clips of the biggest stars like Flair, Race, the Von Erichs, Hogan, Dusty Rhodes, Barry Windham, Bruiser Brody, and others from the other territories. The night before the first Starrcade, McMahon and Harley Race had a secret meeting where McMahon made Race what would have been considered a gigantic money offer at the time, $250,000 guaranteed to no-show Greensboro, where he was going to lose, and come on to WWF's television claiming to be the world heavyweight champion. Race turned him down, both out of loyalty to the promoters who had made him champion, and also because he was part owner of the Kansas City office and St. Louis promotions, and didn't realize how the business would change and how the latter company in particular was about to go from being a major jewel of the business to being totally worthless very quickly. The feeling is that Race taken the offer, because of how wrestling was at the time, the break in the NWA title history with Flair never. Beating Race would have killed the Starrcade concept, and it would have been a difficult blow for the NWA to recover from. But as the years went on, McMahon hit more than he missed on similar deals, and while the Mid-Atlantic territory, with its biggest star as world champion, was about to have its biggest money series of years. Yet, in another example of how quickly even the most successful offices can go down, 5 years later the company was out of business. Flair pinned Race to regain the title on Thanksgiving night at the Greensboro Coliseum at the first Starrcade, in the first modern closed-circuit pro wrestling event in history in the sense they rented 17 arenas throughout the territory to air the show in. It really wasn't as successful as they hoped for, blamed on terrible area weather that night, but with 16,000 live, 2,000 more in the adjacent annex, and about 30,000 more watching on closed circuit the night of a major blizzard. It was the most people to pay for a wrestling match in the US up to that point in history, but was considered a disappointment, as the feeling is the build-up in the territory for this Starrcade, remembered by most fans as the biggest, was the best of any of them, and with better weather they would have doubled or even tripled that number. It is generally considered, even to this day, the single most famous wrestling match ever held in that arena. And as hard as this is to believe, it was the last time he won a championship in the Coliseum. Perhaps that may also be why when Flair does the sports talk show circuit in the area, it is the mid to late 70s through the mid-80s era that the majority of questions are about. In that part of the country, it's as if the pro wrestling that mattered and counted died with the decline in 1987 and eventual death of Jim Crockett Promotions and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling the next year. While much of the country by this point was in the midst of a wrestling war, for the most part, the Carolinas were immune. First, the Crockett family had such strong ties to the key arenas that most wouldn't rent to WWF. Finally, in 1987, shortly after the Pontiac Silverdome show, the WWF was able to book its first date at the Coliseum. Even though Andre the Giant was badly hurt and wasn't being used unless it was a pay-per-view or baseball stadium show, the WWF wanted to prove a point, booking Hulk Hogan versus Andre coming off the record-setting show. The hottest drawing match in history was cause for concern, but in the end, the region showed the other style of wrestling and the national stars didn't mean much, as the show drew only 3,600 fans. It wouldn't be until the late 90s, nearly a decade after the death of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, before a new generation of wrestling fans were in Greensboro. Huge crowds for rare house shows returned on the back of Steve Austin, who even in Greensboro, for a short period of time was more popular than Flair. But it's that era, to this day, where people remember going out with their families to the Coliseum on holidays and seeing Flair steal the show, when they were told and believed that they may not have the superstars from major sports coming to town, but in NASCAR, college basketball and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, they had the best those sports had to offer. At the time, there were no major league sports franchises in the city, and what also needs to be noted is that if you look at the population of Greensboro as compared to most of the wrestling hotbeds of the 70s and 80s, it was really a secondary market that outdrew most of the primary markets. The Greensboro Coliseum was one of the nation's legendary arenas and best wrestling cities. But unlike in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, or Houston, with huge population bases, or St. Louis, which was really a secondary market, Greensboro was only a major market when it came to pro wrestling. In 1980, only 155,642 people lived in the city proper, and 951,000 lived within an hour or so driving distance from the Coliseum, and most of them got regular matches closer to home because they ran all the small cities in the area, as the promotion at its peak was running 3 shows per night within the territory. Drawing 15,000 fans when you consider those numbers is a lot more impressive than doing the same kind of business for a big show at Reunion Arena in Dallas or Madison Square Garden. Flair has repeatedly said his 2 favorite eras as a performer were the 1985-87 Four Horsemen era and the 1973 AWA era when he was breaking in as an opening match wrestler. Indeed, throughout the years, Flair's loyalty to Greensboro has been big, as that night is considered among his career highlights. He was upset, and has repeated for decades, that one of the biggest mistakes Jim Crockett made was in 1987 when he moved Starrcade out of Greensboro, where it had sold out on Thanksgiving night and turned people away the prior 4 years. The prior 2 years were actually a double, as half the show was from the Omni in Atlanta and the other half from Greensboro, since both cities had a Thanksgiving night wrestling tradition. Flair, who headlined what had been a thriving territory for most, but certainly not all, of the prior 13 years, saw the territory go into the toilet in 1988, which forced Crockett out of the business. The decline and losing Starrcade can be tied together, but in reality, the history of wrestling didn't change by that decision. I don't think it even sped up the process, although at the time, the decision to run in Chicago was because the company felt it had to shed its southern image and be perceived as a national company. Chicago was a strong market for the company and the show sold out in advance, and ironically, because of a screw-job finish in the Road Warriors match with Tully Blanchard and Arnold Anderson for the tag titles, business in that city nosedived directly due to having Starrcade there, but the Greensboro fans did feel the slight. Vince McMahon going national changed wrestling. The NWO promoters were still caught in the past and couldn't adapt. while Flair wrestled the old-school champion style, where the goal was to get the local star over. The rules had changed due to McMahon and Hogan creating the superhero world champion. Hogan was a far bigger drawing card and mainstream star than Flair would ever be. But Flair in the 80s created one of the most enduring legends in history. It is doubtful that had Hogan, or just about anyone else, been booked in the manner of Flair in the 90s, that they'd still be considered remembered as anywhere near the level of legend. And Flair supporters can argue, even given all that difference in mainstream push, that when it comes to longtime fans, Flair has achieved a level of respect Hogan didn't, noting that Flair's DVDs have outsold Hogan's, and Flair's book greatly outsold Hogan's. The Flair career comes to a close on or around WrestleMania. There were some stop and starts and numerous second-guessing of the angle on how to get there, but it appears everything is locked and in place. But what has snuck up is the December 29th show in Greensboro, the Raw taping for New Year's Eve. A generation ago, in a taped match, a 52-year-old Nick Bockwinkel as AWA champion, and Curt Hennig did a 60 Minutes draw that aired on ESPN on New Year's Eve. While pro wrestling in the 80s was synonymous with holidays, New Year's Eve was not one of them. Whether Flair, 8 weeks shy of birthday number 59, can create a memory like that match with Triple H is an awfully hard standard to live up to. You can almost draw the comparisons of the night 28 and a half years earlier, when a 30-year-old Flair was in the role of Triple H, carrying a 60-year-old Buddy Rogers in a grudge match that was famous historically, but didn't draw all that well. Not that the goal isn't there. Flair is going to Florida for several days to try and get into shape, as he's really only had 3 matches, all short, since being gone for several months due to an impasse on what to do with his last big run. Since Flair isn't scheduled to work house shows between now and WrestleMania according to the current and ever-changing booking plans, and there is only one television date on the schedule in the Carolinas after a December 30th show in Richmond, Virginia, which is a March 24th live Raw in Columbia, South Carolina. Considering that is a week before Mania, and Flair's Mania program would likely be locked in by that point, while it would make sense for him to do an interview on the show, and they could book him for a tag match since they are going with the idea the career isn't at stake in a tag, it is also possible that this week's show is not only the end of the line in what would be considered Flair's #1 arena, but the end of the era that began almost 34 years ago. This could have been promoted as something beyond gigantic in the local market, but the nature of the angle prevents it from happening, as you can't really advertise it as Flair's last match in Greensboro. It's just the annual visit of WE to the Coliseum, and this year Flair is in an angle where if he loses he retires. People have seen so much of that on television over the past decade that they know not to take it seriously, even if this one, at least as of today, is planned to be, unlike other Flair retirements. There may not be a sellout, although ticket sales are good. Of those there, only a small percentage will really know the significance leaving the arena of what they had just seen. But the truth is, it's also not unusual for wrestling. I saw Ray Stevens' last match at the Cow Palace, and it was nothing special. Some of the older fans good-naturedly catcalled him on the way out, saying, "Hey Ray, get another beer." The newer fans may have heard the name from their parents, but there was clearly no emotional involvement that this short, beer-bellied man in his 50s was once the king of the city and the best at what he did. There is a saying about how old soldiers never die, they just fade away. Young wrestlers die, but old wrestlers fade away. Although by that point it was clear the AWA was dying locally and almost any show could have been its last, there was no reason for the average fan not to believe Stevens would be back in a prelim match next month, and quite frankly, it didn't matter by that time to almost anyone whether he was or wasn't, as history didn't endure in those days and Stevens had long since been considered something special, even at the Cow Palace. And if history is any indication, as much as Flair himself and Vince McMahon may believe it's his last match in the Carolinas, there is always another angle and another gimmick in pro wrestling. Realistically, there are very few arenas where one man is synonymous with pro wrestling in that building. Jerry Lawler at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis comes to mind, as well as Fritz von Erich at the Dallas Sportatorium and the Crusher at the Auditorium in Milwaukee, the Sheik at Cobo Arena in Detroit, Dick the Bruiser in Indianapolis, Carlos Colon in San Juan, or to another generation, Whipper Watson at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto and Bruno Sammartino in Madison Square Garden, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Boston. You can make an argument for Dusty Rhodes in many of the Florida arenas, and perhaps Stevens at the Cow Palace in San Francisco and Fred Blassie at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Some would say Vern Gagne in Minneapolis, but virtually everyone in Minneapolis who attended the shows would say the Crusher was really the bigger draw than Gagne for most of the AWA heyday. But even most of those names didn't have the enduring local legacy. Everyone from every generation in the Mid-Atlantic region knows of Flair, And when he goes on talk shows, the people bring up Wahoo McDaniel, Blackjack Mulligan, Dusty Rhodes, Magnum TA and the stars of the 70s and 80s. Probably the single reason that memories of the Mid-Atlantic territory have stayed while the younger generation in Texas barely knows Fritz Von Erich and in San Francisco doesn't know Stevens, is because Flair has remained a fixture on television for so long. The reason, probably as much as anything, is Triple H, who grew up with Flair as his favorite wrestler and put Flair back in the spotlight for a last major run in Evolution nearly 15 years after the suits in WCW thought the aging Flair was the reason they couldn't catch the WWE. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.